Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here representing Jason Blaha Strength and Fitness, and today I want to chat with you guys and gals a little bit about the rather silly idea that some people postulate that squats and deadlifts are not great for muscle mass. But a quick reminder, if you guys will please click like down below and drop me a comment, I would appreciate it so much. Thank you. So to me, this is a very strange take as a lifter and a coach coming from a strength background. Because, for me, there were periods of time when that's all that I had. Uh, and that's all I do these days, actually, that and sled work for my lower body, right? I mean, currently I do that, and I have pretty good sized legs. But I always thought it was interesting that when you see people say that, because again, back like when I was in the UK, that's again all that I had, and my quads were big, everything was big of squatting 500 at the time I spent there when I was training in a shed, right? Pretty much a little shed, and I had all my stuff set up there, and that's where I trained outside. Okay, had a squat rack, had a couple different bars, but I mean it was squats and deadlifts. And even these days, I do squat, deadlift, and sled, and I have clients who do the same just fine. And I put plenty of clients on machines. I like leg presses and things like that. I think they have their place. But I also have plenty of clients on minimalist type programs who are strong. They have big legs with no problems, and I think that's fascinating. But people will also point out, well, we mean for bodybuilding purposes, not just big. But here's the thing with that idea. Before we go further into that, are your followers really bodybuilders? Are your followers really bodybuilders? I don't think there's enough bodybuilders in the world, realistically, who are going to watch any one influencer or person out there to give them enough audience to pay the bills. There just aren't. I mean, there aren't that many bodybuilders. You're telling me you have 100,000 followers who are bodybuilders? Probably not. So it's a very strange argument to me. It's a bodybuilder being someone who's going to compete. And your argument would be, well, we think we're going to get the last 1% of our possible muscle growth. All right, we're chasing that last 1% for competitive purposes. Okay. And they're always talking about, with leg development here. But I think the big picture that people are missing is the ironic part is that dudes who want a big upper body, squats and deadlifts will contribute to that. And I think that gets forgotten in the conversation. But let's talk about the lower body first, and then we'll go over into this upper body. Why can't you build massive legs with squats and deadlifts? I mean, even look at evidence that you have. We've had hypertrophy studies. Like we've had at least one hypertrophy study. Remember when they put the hip thrust head to head with a full squat, and they had those women do it? It was during all the rage when the hip thrust was all the rage, right? What did they find? They found that doing 6 sets to failure per week caused more glute growth than 6 sets to failure with the hip thrust. It was not a huge amount more, but it was at least statistically significant. Both produced profound results in glutes. But when it was actually studied, the full range of motion squat, they have them doing, again, deep squats, ass to grass squats. They got slightly more glute growth, obviously a lot more quad growth. And when they even tested their strength, the squat improved the hip thrust just as much as the hip thrust did. In other words, they tested their 1 rep maxes on the squat and the hip thrust at the start of the study and tested them after. The people who didn't even perform the hip thrust but got big with the squat had great hip thrust performance. Their maxes went up just as much. They got just as much additional strength. But obviously the hip thrust didn't carry over to the squat the same. So again, the point was it beat the hip thrust. Noting that the hip thrust, of course, did cause some quad growth. But ultimately, you saw considerably more quad growth and slightly more glute growth. Okay, and this is one of the movements that a lot of these same people love. You're like, oh, hip thrusts are great. I'm not saying hip thrust isn't a good exercise. It is a good exercise. I think it's a very good exercise. But it wasn't better even for the glutes. Right? And historically, no one has ever struggled to build big quads. Look how many people live on squats who have massive quads. So many athletes, weightlifters, other people, they have quads. What are we talking about? Why are we pretending it's not amazing? And the same people who say, yeah, but the back can be the limiting factor. Well, your back gets built with it. Again, it's not like you're not building quads. People come up with these strange ideas of, well, different things can be a limiting factor. Just like those studies that looked at pulling for the back and what they found for drug-free lifters, that lats grew just as much from not using straps as they did from straps, even when the people perceived that their grip was the limiting factor. And it's been pointed out, unless you're doing cheat rows as an enhanced lifter, you're not going to have that problem. In other words, this is what was found looking at it in studies. So people worried about the grip being a limiting factor of building the back on rows and pull-ups and lat pull-downs. Well, it turned out it's not. So even if people perceived it to be, the growth, the muscle growth was just as good if the sets were hard. No difference, other than they didn't get forearm and grip. And that's kind of what I'm saying with some of this. We have these conversations. You have zero evidence whatsoever. There is no actual evidence that the perception of the back and trunk being a limiting factor on the squat actually causes less muscle growth in the lower body. In fact, because if it were, then people wouldn't get all these amazing lower body results. Yet they do. And when it's been compared, the squat beat the hip thrust for lower body hypertrophy. So if the upper body is a limiting factor, then that shouldn't occur. And this happened in women who are more likely to have the upper body be the limiting factor. This was a women's study. Okay. You don't have any studies whatsoever showing that the back being a limiting factor causes less hamstring development from a deadlift, on a normal conventional deadlift. All right. Now then when we start looking at EMGs, let's talk about other stuff. A squat beat a calf raise for EMG activation of the calves. How many people out there are good squatters who have good calves? Lots of them. But what if you're doing sled work and other stuff too? Well, that covers all that. That covers it. That will build your calves. But then same thing, we look at some of those EMG data, which again is not always hypertrophy data. What do we find for the deadlift, the lats? It caused a tremendous activation, technically higher ratings than all the lat exercises did. And I'm not saying it's better, but what happens when we have looked at it? The only studies that have looked at deadlift hypertrophy and squat hypertrophy, not only did they cause a lot of it, it was significant upper body, and the deadlift particularly. So that's another point to think about. All these people are worried about, the bodybuilding end and or getting people bigger, yet the squat and the deadlift cause upper body growth too. And that's not speculation. That's been seen in research. So you take something like a squat, which we know will cause some upper body growth. The deadlift absolutely causes more. But when it's compared, it's not like these other lower body exercises exceed them. And that's the point. And they can argue all that they want about stimulus versus fatigue, upper body limits. But when they are looked at head to head, these more isolated movements that don't load the spine don't cause more lower body growth. They don't have evidence to this. Sure, they could argue stimulus to fatigue all day long. But what happens when it's measured? Squat's a monster. Happens when it's measured. Deadlift is a monster for hypertrophy. They're discussing ideas and hypotheses that when they're actually measured are not really panning out based on the evidence. Okay? And again, you're going to build muscles of the trunk and the back with these movements. They're going to cause more than just leg movements. And their argument, well, what if we only want to isolate the legs? Well, why? If your legs are growing from these movements, why do you care about isolating the legs? Take the free upper body development to go with it. What it is that these are lazy people. They have a lazy audience. And then if they are bodybuilders, most of them are on so many drugs that a lot of squats and deadlifts become problematic. And that's the real issue. Those two factors. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.